Charles Tittle was born in 1939, earning a degree in history from a small college in Arkansas before completing his sociology PhD at the University of Texas in 1965. He has moved around several times since then, teaching at Indiana University, Florida Atlantic University, the University of Maryland, and then for 12 years at Washington State University, where he met Mark Stafford. He has been at North Carolina State University since 2000, where he continues to study deviance and social control. Mark Stafford was born in Texas and graduated from Southern Methodist University in 1971. He earned his graduate degrees at the University of Arizona, completing his PhD in 1979. After spending almost 20 years at Washington State University, where he contributed to this paper in 1992, he returned to Texas in 1995 and spent over a decade in sociology at UT Austin before moving to Texas State University in 2008 as a professor of criminology. He is an international authority on crime and delinquency. This article uses special survey data set collected in 3 different states, spanning the range from rural areas to central cities. It was specifically designed to address the issue of how urban, suburban, and rural areas may affect social relationships differently, so the authors have measures that are better suited than most studies to evaluating the competing claims of different theories about city life.
Of urbanism as an influence on people's attitudes and behavior shows up in many diverse fields, and not only among urban scholars in sociology. This paper by a couple of criminologists shows how the debate has carried over into other fields, leading researchers like Tittle and Stafford to try their hand at testing the different theories of urban consequences in social life. Since they study deviance and social control, of course they're interested to see whether these theories can predict variations in such social processes in different corners of the urban community. This is why they would like to know whether the idea of a continuum of varying social behavior can be observed as we move from rural areas to smaller non-metropolitan towns, to the suburbs of metro areas, and finally into the central cities. In particular, since they start by assuming that such a continuum of attitudes and behavior does exist, they want to know whether the suburbs fit into this continuum pretty much where we would expect. That is, not quite as urban, whatever that actually means, as the central cities, but more urban in outlook than small towns and rural areas. What urban in this context, and what kinds of variations we expect in social outcomes, depends on which of the major theoretical approaches we find the most convincing. For example, if we start from the urban anomie theory championed by Lewis Wirth, we expect urbanism to translate into more feelings of isolation and anonymity, but also more tolerance for differences and a generally universalistic outlook. From this perspective, Tittle and Stafford want to know whether the suburbs fit into the larger urban-rural continuum when they try to measure such attitudes. On the other hand, if urban anomie theory is actually just a red herring, and there's no real variation based solely on the type of community where people live, this would support the compositional theory suggested by Herbert Gans, Oscar Lewis, and others. From this perspective, they would expect that the personal characteristics of people would explain their attitudes and behavior, no matter where they live. For this reason, they introduce a lot of such personal characteristics such as age, sex, race, education, marital status, and so on into their models, to see whether these characteristics explain away all the variations in social attitudes and leave nothing for place-based theories to explain. People in the suburbs should not be any different from people anyplace else, according to this perspective, once we take all these personal characteristics into account. Finally, they also consider Claude Fisher's subcultural theory, wondering whether higher urban social density and larger populations translate into critical mass for subcultures that crystallize around special communities of interest. This perspective has very different predictions about feelings of anonymity and tolerance in urban settings, in contrast to what we might expect from urban anomie theory. Once again, their central focus is on whether suburbs fit into such a theoretical picture. Tittle and Stafford assume that suburbs have lower population density than central cities, and also greater social homogeneity in terms of personal characteristics. If both of these conditions do describe the suburbs, then subcultural theory might predict that there should be less intensity of subgroup formation, less dense social networks, and also less deviance driven by subcultural variations within suburban areas compared to central cities. But after they review all three of these usual suspects for interpreting place-based variations in attitudes and behavior, they remain skeptical about whether any of them will turn out to be particularly useful. After all, both urban anomie theory and subcultural theory originally were developed to take account of the social consequences of living in the very diverse, densely settled, and fast-paced central cities of our increasingly urban society. The images of crowds of strangers jostling each other, forcing interpersonal interactions, or enabling critical mass for diverse subcultures, are drawn from city streets lined with skyscrapers, filled with honking taxis, packing all kinds of different people together under pressure in the urban environment. These images have very little to do with suburban life, and Tittle and Stafford can't help wondering whether maybe the same could also be true for the theories seeking to describe such more truly urban images. This is why they focus on the suburbs, and why they set out to find some actual evidence that might shed some light on what suburbs are actually like as social environment. Are suburbs really areas characterized by low crime rates, a high degree of social conformity, and little tolerance for deviance? Are there more ties to neighbors in the suburbs than in central cities? And are there less ties to neighbors in suburbs than in small towns or rural areas? Where do the suburbs fit in the urban-rural continuum, or is there even such a continuum at all? To it, there are not a lot of places to look for good representative evidence of urban place effects on attitudes and behavior, evidence that will stand up to careful empirical tests and that will provide adequate measures of the different competing perspectives. We might organize a whole team of trained investigators to conduct intensive participant investigation in a wide range of different communities, but even then we would still only know about those specific communities, and we wouldn't be able to say for certain that anything we observed among these special settings could be generalized to the rest of an entire society. There could always be something odd or unique about the places we chose to study, and other places could be completely different. So we need data that are representative of the whole society, or at least of a broad cross-section of it. This argues for some kind of sample surveying approach. The questions in such a survey must measure enough of the background characteristics of individuals to allow us to control for these compositional factors, so that we can take into account the suggestions by Gans and Oscar Lewis that these are the things that matter, that really predict how people think and behave. We also need to have good measures of where people and their communities are located on the urban-rural continuum to see whether such a continuum exists or matters. Finally, we need some kind of questions to measure whether people are experiencing feelings of isolation and anomie, whether they are engaged in intensive subcultural communities, and so on, so we can directly test the ideas of Wirth and Fisher. Stafford decided to use a 1972 survey which was already almost 20 years old when they wrote this article. Today, data come from more than 40 years in the past, so we legitimately might ask whether even if we find some clear social patterns in these survey responses, the world might well have changed dramatically in the following 4 decades. On the other hand, if the urban anomie theory or the compositional theory or the subcultural theory turn out to be good ways to explain the patterns of responses in this old survey, we may be able to regard them as valid evidence for or against the different theories of urban life. After all, if water runs downhill on one particular hillside, we feel justified in thinking that it might also run downhill on any other hillside we care to observe. They chose this 1972 survey for several reasons. First of all, it is not exactly a representative sample of the entire U.S. population, but it does systematically include several important sources of possible variations in attitudes and behavior. The 2,000 or so respondents include people from 3 different states: New Jersey on the East Coast, Iowa in the middle of the country, and Oregon on the West Coast. All three of these states were used for the survey because they each include large metropolitan areas, but also a substantial population in small towns and rural areas. So unlike many other surveys, this study includes information on people who actually live out in the countryside, real rural residents. It also includes people from small towns, and from both the suburbs and the central cities of large metro areas. In these respects, the survey gives us a solid basis for comparing the entire urban-rural spectrum and assessing the place of suburban communities along that spectrum. Second, the survey included a whole battery of questions that assess how the respondents think about what Tittle and Stafford are most interested in studying. That is, criminal and deviant behavior. There's a substantial laundry list of such items, including criminal activity such as petty theft, larceny, illegal gambling, physical assault, marijuana use, since it was totally illegal at that time, and cheating on one's income tax return. It also included questions about some other activities that are not exactly against the law, but that are widely regarded as violating informal norms of social behavior. These deviant acts included lying to a spouse, cheating in various ways in your personal, non-business life, and even an odd little question about remaining seated while everybody else stands up for the national anthem at a public event. For each of these examples of crime or deviance, respondents answered several different questions. Did they think the action was morally wrong? Did they think that if they engaged in the action, their friends and family would find out about it? Did they think that there should be laws against the deviant, but not actually criminal kinds of behavior? These responses about possible deviant and criminal acts gave Tittle and Stafford information that they thought they could use to test the different theories of urban place effects on social life. If more people in some kinds of community responded that no one would find out if they engaged in things like illegal gambling, lying to their spouses, marijuana use, or cheating on their taxes, this could be evidence for greater perceptions of isolation and anonymity in such communities. On the other hand, if less people in a community thought that there ought to be a law against things like marijuana use or gambling, this could be evidence for greater tolerance of social diversity in such communities. These deviance questions, though central to the interests of the authors, don't provide insights into all possible dimensions of the urban anomie or subculture theories. Fortunately, a number of additional questions also were asked as part of this survey. There are several questions that have been around for many decades and that get included on a lot of surveys, like the General Social Survey and others, that are designed to get at the question of anomie directly. These questions ask things like, in general, do you think that people can be trusted or that they will take advantage of you every chance they get? Or, are people generally just out for themselves, or are they willing to help others when needed? And is the lot of the average man getting worse or better? Tittle and Stafford use responses to these traditional anomia questions to measure the extent of anomie and alienation among respondents in different settings. They also turn to some social network-like questions about whether the respondent thinks that most people in the local community know lots of their neighbors, only a few of their neighbors, or practically none of their neighbors. They consider the answers to these questions in order to judge the extent and strength of social bonds in the community. Finally, they return to the list of criminal and deviant acts mentioned in survey questions and consider whether respondents answered that they had actually done any of these actions themselves. Had they engaged in illegal gambling? Had they lied to their spouses? Had they remained seated during the national anthem? These direct answers about personal behaviors provided them with a measure of how much deviance was actually going on in different places. Armed with all these different measures of attitudes and behavior, and keeping in mind all the personal characteristics of people, like age, sex, race, education, and so on, Tittle and Stafford then constructed a series of statistical models to see whether there were any actual urban place effects or patterns in the attitude and behavior outcomes, after netting out any influence from the personal characteristics. The results from Tittle and Stafford's statistical models appear in a table in the article in several columns of numbers. Later on, toward the end of the article, they also portray some of these results as line graphs to help us visualize the patterns they find. This seems like a good idea, so here you will find our own set of graphs made from the model results listed in their table in the article. At the bottom of each graph, we will have the 4 categories of the rural-urban continuum, from rural to non-metro towns, then suburbs and metro areas, and finally the central cities themselves. For the first measure, based on people's answers that they thought they might be able to do the deviant and criminal acts mentioned in the survey without anyone finding out about it, higher scores mean that respondents more often felt that they could get away with such acts. Lots of results start from 0 for the rural areas because their models took this as the reference group. All these figures show differences compared to the reference group of rural respondents. This graph climbs upward from left to right, indicating that overall this sense of anonymity increases as we move from rural areas toward the central cities. Exception though, the suburbs seem out of place, too high for where they should be in a more linear sequence. They actually seem to feel more anonymous than do people in the central cities. This line with the white boxes represents the answers of respondents in each kind of place before we take into account that different places may have different concentrations of old or young people, men or women, low education or high education, and so on. A model that also includes adjustments for all these compositional characteristics of people, what kind would be produced? We can find out by simply graphing the second or adjusted column of results in their table, also anonymity survey outcome. Adjusting for compositional differences, we get the line shown in the figure with black boxes instead. The line runs generally upward from left to right. Its sense of anonymity is stronger as you move from rural areas toward central cities. The cross areas are smaller though, and in fact the differences become very small between town, suburbs, and central cities. The real difference for this group of questions was between rural respondents and everybody else. Recognize that the kind of people most likely to feel anonymous, based on personal characteristics, also are more likely to live in suburbs. The suburban result on this adjusted line fits very naturally in between the town and city patterns. It seems like support for the urban anomie idea, because after all, if city residents were forming tight-knit, intense subcultures, they should not feel anonymous. They should feel too tied in with the others in their little groups to be able to keep secrets about crimes or deviance. Results for the tolerance outcome turn out a little differently. In any compositional adjustment, we see a nice, almost straight line of increasing tolerance as we move from rural areas into central cities. The pattern looks very clear and could be seen as more support for urban anomie, since depersonalization and greater tolerance of differences is supposed to be part of the effect of cities breaking down primary groups and relationships. But after adjusting for the personal characteristics of people, we see a new pattern. The second line looks very much like the first one, except in the case of the suburbs. It would seem that the suburbs only look tolerant on the surface because they tend to attract residents who have personal characteristics, like being younger, more educated, and so on, that increase tolerance. If 4 areas had the same basic mix of people in terms of these personal characteristics, a lower level for tolerance of deviant behavior would be revealed in the suburbs as shown here. Adjusting for compositional effects, the suburbs are actually less tolerant of deviant behavior even than people in small towns. This result calls to mind the suburban stereotype of neighborhoods where you're not allowed to paint your mailbox the wrong color, or park a boat in your driveway, or even string a clothesline behind your house because the neighbors won't tolerate it. When we come to alienation, as measured by the traditional anomia questions on the survey, people will be fair and honest or selfish and dishonest, we see that distrust and alienation again appear to increase with proximity to central cities of metro areas. The pattern hardly changes at all when we take into account differences in the mix of personal characteristics. The only unusual feature of these two lines is that both of them show higher alienation for true rural residents than for people living in small towns. extremely lonely life on isolated U.S. farms, in contrast to the village agricultural life found in many other countries, might help to explain why the rural residents do not have the lowest levels of measured alienation among respondents to the survey. The questions about whether people know all, most, a few, or none of their neighbors translates into the measure that Tittle and Stafford refer to as weak bonds. Bonds mean people don't know many of their neighbors well. The higher this line, the higher the share of people saying they know none or only a few of their neighbors. And as for alienation, we observe very little effect of controls for personal characteristics in this case. Both lines move up and down in the same way and remain quite close to each other throughout their length. The difference for this measure of disconnectedness is that the suburbs appear to be out of place again. After adjusting for personal characteristics, suburban respondents were almost as likely as rural people to say they knew all or most of their neighbors, and this is a sharp contrast with both the town residents and the people from central cities, the two groups who apparently don't bother much with getting to know their neighbors. Although once again we might interpret the overall upward trend from left to right as support for urban anomia theory, we have to admit that the suburbs don't fit the pattern. If anything, it looks like the suburbs have lots of strong ties in spite of their larger population. Authors do not present this as evidence for subcultural theory, because that perspective does not predict that dense social networks will be most common in suburbs. Of diversity there is supposed to discourage such subcultures in comparison with the opportunities for unusual groups to come together in central cities. Finally, Tittle and Stafford get back to their favorite subject, the question about crime and deviance, and their favorite answers, the ones about whether respondents actually engaged in these behaviors personally. This time we see yet another kind of pattern appear. Deviant behavior is relatively rare in both rural areas and small towns. Rural cities, in contrast, appear to be hotbeds of deviance and crime, much as the urban anomia theory would predict. Of course, this could be interpreted as at least consistent in some ways with subcultural theory, if we reflect that the items listed as deviants in the survey might actually fit into the counter norms expected of each other by members of a deviant subculture. Fortunately, there are no questions on this survey about whether people actually belong to any deviant subcultures, so even this survey could be improved on for our purposes. Again, in this case, as for weak social bonds, and in the case of tolerance, the suburbs go off in an unexpected direction. The same suburban residents who report that they have little tolerance for deviant behavior and who report close ties with many of their neighbors also report the lowest level of any group for actually engaging in any of the deviant acts themselves. All three results are consistent with each other and make sense when considered together. Apparently the suburbs, at least in 1972, really were very conformist places, more so even than small towns in some respects. These findings should serve as yet another reminder to us that in urban societies today, the urban setting itself has gotten so large, so dispersed, and so sorted out into different areas of the city that we no longer should think of urban as any sort of uniform, homogenized social reality. The complexity and diversity of cities today requires more sophisticated models and description.